Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to make a quick video talking about primary, secondary, and tertiary, both hypo and hyperthyroidism. All right, so we're going to start with primary hypothyroidism. So primary means that the disorder is actually in the thyroid gland itself. All right, so let's start out with the thyroid gland itself. So we know that the thyroid gland produces both T3 and T4. So in hypo, our T3 and T4 are decreased. Okay, so T3 and T4 are decreased. All right, so the negative feedback system from the thyroid gland tells the hypothalamus, because T3 and T4 are low, that we need to increase production to try to increase them. So the negative feedback system tells the hypothalamus, hey, hypothalamus, produce more thyroid releasing hormone. That then in turn acts on the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases more thyroid stimulating hormone, which should act on the thyroid gland. However, in the case of primary hypothyroidism, the problem is in the thyroid gland. So when this goes to act on the thyroid gland, it does not work. Okay, so in the case of primary hypothyroidism, your T3 and T4 will be decreased. Your thyroid releasing hormone and your thyroid stimulating hormone, both TRH and TSH, will be increased. That is for primary. Now we move on to secondary hypothyroidism. When it comes to secondary, the problem is in the anterior pituitary gland itself, all right? Because we are still with hypothyroidism, no matter what is happening with primary, secondary, or tertiary hypothyroidism, T3 and T4 will always be decreased. Negative feedback system kicks feedback back up to the hypothalamus and says, hey, produce more thyroid releasing hormone. So the hypothalamus does. It releases more. Okay? Now, unfortunately, when that thyroid releasing hormone goes to act on the anterior pituitary, it does not work. So in that case, thyroid stimulating hormone stays decreased, therefore, as well as T3 and T4. So in our secondary hypothyroidism, T3 and T4 again will always be decreased. Our thyroid stimulating hormone will also be decreased. And in this case, our thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus will actually be increased. Then we get to our tertiary hypothyroidism. So in this case, the problem is actually in the hypothalamus, all right? So start with, again, we're talking about hypothyroidism, so no matter what, T3 and T4 are going to be decreased. Again, negative feedback system kicks feedback back up to the hypothalamus and says, hey, produce more thyroid releasing hormone. Unfortunately, the problem is in the thyroid gland, or in the hypothalamus itself, so it does not increase the amount of thyroid releasing hormone. It stays decreased, which then in turn acts on the anterior pituitary to also keep thyroid stimulating hormone decreased. So in the case of tertiary, when there's a hypothalamus problem, T3 and T4 will be decreased. Thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary will also be decreased, as well as thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Okay, so now let's talk about primary hyperthyroidism. So now we're talking about an overproduction of that T3 and T4. Again, because in any of our hyperthyroidism, primary, secondary, or tertiary, again, T3 and T4 will always be increased. The negative feedback system kicks back up feedback to the hypothalamus that says, hey, release less thyroid releasing hormone. This hormone acts on the anterior pituitary, and anterior pituitary ends up releasing decreasing thyroid stimulating hormone. Since our disorder is in the thyroid gland itself, it does not drop the T3 and T4 levels. So in our primary hyperthyroidism, T3 and T4 will be increased. Thyroid stimulating hormone will be decreased. And the thyroid releasing hormone will also be decreased. That is in primary hyperthyroidism. Now we're going to move to secondary hyperthyroidism. So our problem is now in the anterior pituitary gland itself. So again, we are hyperthyroid. So no matter what, T3 and T4 will be increased. That negative feedback is sent to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus goes, hey, we have too much T3 and T4 in the body system. Let's decrease the thyroid releasing hormone. This hormone should act on the anterior pituitary, but this, because of problems with the anterior pituitary, it does not do what it's supposed to. So as opposed to decreasing thyroid stimulating hormone to eventually decrease T3 and T4, what happens is with the thyroid stimulating hormone, it stays producing high amounts of TSH. So in secondary hyperthyroidism, T3 and T4 will be increased. Thyroid stimulating hormone will also be increased. Thyroid releasing hormone will be decreased. And our last one is tertiary hyperthyroidism. Okay? So again, in our tertiary hyperthyroidism, T3 and T4 will always be increased. Negative feedback from the thyroid gland is sent up to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, because the problem is actually here in the hypothalamus, normally it should decrease TRH, but that mechanism is not working. So in this case, TRH ends up being released from the hypothalamus, which acts on the anterior pituitary. TSH is also increased. So T3 and T4 stays increased in the blood levels. So for tertiary T3 and T4, tertiary hyperthyroidism, not only are T3 and T4 increased, but TSH is also increased, as well as the thyroid releasing hormone. I will actually upload a couple documents that will also help with understanding of this, but I hope this helped with your understanding of primary, secondary, and tertiary, both hypo and hyperthyroidism.